another episode of the Dope Student Podcast.
Hi, I'm Jemiah,
Hi, I'm Julia.
and welcome back to the Dope Student Podcast. Today we have here
Lori Arnold.
And we're going to ask you some questions about your career.
Cool.
Let's start with, can you explain what architectural conservation entails and how it differs from general historic preservation?
Sure. Architectural conservation is about the materials that make the building. It has to do with if you put a new building attached to an old building, you have to think about how those new materials affect and will behave next to the old. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it makes a huge difference in how a building performs ultimately.
what sparked your interest in saving our built heritage and lead you to pursue a career in architectural conservation?
Well, I started out as an artist. I worked at the Museum of Modern Art, and I knew I had to do something else. I was young, and I was in charge of the painting and sculpture collection, and I had to look at it every day to make sure that it was safe and not harmed. And the people that do that in the museum that repair the paintings are called conservators. But I didn't want to be a painting conservator. So a friend of mine introduced me to the program where I went to graduate school. And the science side of it kind of hooked me.
Interesting. What educational background and training are essential for someone aspiring to become an architectural conservator?
I would say maybe a master's degree there are many schools that teach it. But I think also with experience, because when I go to a job site, I will discuss what's going on with the mason, not the person that designed the repair, not the project manager or anybody like that. I talk to the tradesperson so that I can understand what's coming next, what's going on, what problems are you having. And I think over time, if you were to be in the trades and doing that on a regular basis, I don't think you would need a program, an education program. I think experience would teach you what I spent a lot of money to learn.
What specific skills and knowledge areas are crucial for success in your field?
Chemistry. Knowing how something is made. I had to learn how mortar was mixed in order for me to understand the chemical process and how it cures. What is going on in there chemically that tells me, oh, good, it's hard now. And so chemistry, yes, and knowing your material.
Could you share some of the notable projects you've worked on, such as preserving slave cabins or artist home, and what impact they had on your community, on the community?
One of my best projects was at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage plantation in Tennessee. When he first moved to the plantation, he built 2 cabins, and he lived in those while the big house was being built. And I was brought on because these cabins were log cabins. And I found the project kind of like, whoa, this is huge. And we had to decide what would be the perfect way to do it. And there was nobody else telling me what to do, so I got to decide everything. And we took those cabins down apart. We conserved, we repaired each log that had rot on it. We would cut the rot out and put a new piece of the same wood in. And we did that to all the logs. Then we did a chemical study of the stuff that goes between the logs. And we remix that with the dirt from the plantation and with lime and and local sand, and that's what we shoved in between the logs. We whitewashed all the interior so we'd know what it felt like originally, and it was a really mind-blowing project. We found all kinds of things stuck between the logs, like a baby doll head and keys. We found something like a hair thing made out of bone. But it was wonderful. I got to do a project and complete a project exactly the way it should be done. And also, I'm still the conservator for Jackson Pollock's studio floor. And if you guys don't know who Jackson Pollock is, he's the guy that does those big splatter paintings with all the drips. And the way he did those is he laid the canvas down on the floor and then just drip paint all over it. And some of that paint would go outside of the canvas. So when he lifted the canvas up, you could kind of tell what painting he had done. And his whole studio floor is covered with those paintings. So there have been some soft places because you can go there and you can walk on it and you could touch it. You could put your hand where his hand was. And some of the spots on the floor get soft, and I go in and put wax underneath to make them hard again. But I love that project. That is a very dear project to me.
How do you involve and empower local communities in your preservation efforts, especially when working on projects within their neighborhoods?
I started at a certain point when I was doing projects. After about 10 years, I started noticing that, of course, I learned a little bit about it in school in a different sector called planning. But I had never really thought that repairing a building would make that big a deal in a neighborhood. And I would have neighbors come up to me and ask, well, what are you doing? And I would explain that. And it just came to my attention that some of these neighborhoods were fragile and they had important people in them, people that had been there for, their whole lives. And my preservation work, I feared, would push them out. So I started asking if they needed help. And a lot of them needed help with having their property taxes appealed or getting a councilman's attention. I'm working right now with the neighborhood that's right behind the Met because they suffer from all that traffic. So I started taking on, I'm going to go to city council meeting. And I started introducing myself, and many got to know me. And I went to Point Breeze, let's say, and knocked on doors and said, hey, let me help you appeal your taxes so you don't go anywhere. Because I think that controlling gentrification in our neighborhoods is important.
What are some common challenges you faced in architectural conservation, and how do you address them?
Honestly, being a woman is difficult. I struggle with how I have a PhD, and I still have men trying to explain to me what my PhD is in. And I have some men that won't even deal with a woman in construction. And that's annoying. That's just infuriating. And I don't know if it's because I see it now, but it's something that I feel like is getting worse. And as women, we have to dig in. We just have to dig in. If you know your facts, if you know your stuff, I'm sorry, you're just as good as a man, period. And in a lot of cases, if I show up to a job site and it's a female crew, I know the work will be good, period.
What guidance would you offer to students interested in pursuing a career in architectural conservation?
I would say stay in the trades. I think that's a much better way to use your time to make yourself useful and give you a skill. I was told growing up that if you don't have work, you need to have a skill that'll always feed you, and the trades would take care of you. Architectural conservation with a big fancy degree doesn't. So it's important. It's important to. I mean, if you want to do the education and go that route, awesome. But I think that if you really studied the material you were working with, you'd be just as good as me.
As a woman with extensive experience in the building industry, what insights can you share about navigating and succeeding in this field?
I think you have to understand going into it that women's minds work differently than men. And that sometimes makes a boss anxious. And if you say, well, I don't take notes like that, or I did take pictures, you just didn't see me doing it. It's a lot of that kind of making them understand that you do things differently and better, and that is just, that's your challenge.
How do you approach integrating modern materials and techniques with historic structures during restoration projects? We look at what the existing material is, and then we figure out how to replace it. And with preservation, the best practice is to put back what's already there. And that means if you're going to cut a chunk of wood out of a 100-year-old piece of building, you have to put back a 100-year-old piece of wood. Because it's the way the two behave when they sit next to each other. So best practice is to put back what was already there. The same with mortar. If you go back and repoint an old building, you have to use the same mortar they did. And there are architectural conservators that can analyze the existing mortar and tell you a recipe for historic mortar. But that's pretty much how you integrate the two.
Can you discuss how restoring a single building can lead to positive changes within a neighborhood?
Oh, absolutely. The John Coltrane House is one. That took a long time for the city to call historic and to give money to. And it had a whole organization that supported it. And it was something that the neighborhood felt really strongly about. And so to have that now restored and designated and everybody knows it's protected now, it gives pride and it gives value to the community because the people that live there know the importance of that building.
Could you share experience where working with students brought new perspective or unexpected discoveries to your projects?
Sure. I used to work in New York City, and which means you have a whole lot of work. And I always had an intern. And those interns, I preferred for them to either be in college or getting ready to go into college because students are from a different generation than I am. And I like to say that as I get older, my brain gets harder. And students have fresh brains. And you take a problem and you solve it differently than I would because my age and experience
tells me what the rules are. And students don't know the rules. And my interns seldom did. For research, they were brilliant. And a lot of times solving like an installation detail, they did a great job. I've designed ways to replace a windowsill without removing the window. And that was from somebody that was 22 who came up with it.
What was it like transitioning from being an assistant curator at MOMA to focusing on architectural conservation, and how have these experiences influenced your approach to preservation?
That's a good question. I was of a certain type when I worked at the Museum of Modern Art. I was always wearing heels and, had to have good hair. And I talked about art. I didn't break a nail or anything like that. But when I started in conservation, I would hang off a building. I would get on scaffolding 13 stories high. I would put on a harness. I would climb up ladders, and I was filthy. I was so dirty all the time. I had no nails. I loved it. It was like going back to school to play, because that's what it felt like.
Thank you, Lori Arnold, for sharing your story today. We hope our listeners that are listening today, any information that was shared with us, impact on your future. And that's it for this episode. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Dope Student Podcast. Stay curious and stay dope, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Bye.